What truly shapes a person's success? Is it the advantage of being born with natural talent, the relentless hours of hard work, put in day after day, or the unseen lessons from everyday struggles and failures that slowly turn ordinary people into stronger, wiser, and more capable versions of themselves? The first F I ever received was in Mrs. Henderson's third grade math class, written in red ink across my quiz like a brand of failure. I stared at that paper, watching my classmate Kevin breeze through problems that left me confused and frustrated. Kevin never studied, never struggled, never seemed to doubt himself. Math came to him like breathing, natural, effortless, obvious. "Don't worry, Danny," my mom said when I brought the quiz home, tears still fresh on my cheeks. "Some people are just naturally good at math. You'll find your thing." But what if I didn't have a thing? What if I was just ordinary? Kevin lived 3 houses down from us, and his life seemed touched by magic. Perfect grades without trying. Captain of every sports team. Friends who gathered around him like he was the sun. Teachers smiled when he walked into rooms. Parents used him as an example for their own kid. "Why can't you be more like Kevin?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. Meanwhile, I was the kid who studied for hours and still scored below average. The one picked last for teams. The one who sat alone at lunch, watching the naturally gifted kids shine without effort. By middle school, I'd accepted my place in the world's hierarchy. Some people were born special. Others, like me, were born to admire them from a distance. The turning point came in 7th grade, during the most humiliating moment of my academic life. Mr. Peterson assigned us to present book reports in front of the class. Kevin chose a thick novel I'd never heard of and delivered a brilliant analysis that made everyone, including the teacher, nod in appreciation. When my turn came, I walked to the front of the room with shaking hands, clutching notes about a much simpler book. Halfway through my presentation, I lost my place, started stuttering, and completely forgot what I'd planned to say. The class sat in uncomfortable silence as I stood there, drowning in my own inadequacy. "Take your time, Danny," Mr. Peterson said gently, but I couldn't. I mumbled something about finishing later and rushed back to my seat, my face burning with shame. That night, I decided I was done being embarrassed by my own limitations. If I couldn't be naturally gifted like Kevin, I'd have to find another way. I started small, practicing presentations in front of my bedroom mirror until my voice stopped shaking. I read books twice, once for content, once for understanding. I wrote out key points on index cards and rehearsed until the words felt natural. When Mr. Peterson offered extra credit presentations, I volunteered, not because I was good at public speaking, but because I was determined to get better. Each presentation was still nerve-wracking, but gradually I noticed something changing. My voice stayed steady. My thoughts stayed organized. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. "Danny, you've really improved this semester," Mr. Peterson told me after my 4th extra credit presentation. "You're becoming quite a confident speaker." I almost laughed. Confident wasn't how I felt. Prepared was more accurate. I'd simply learned to work harder than my fear. High school brought new challenges and new comparisons. Kevin continued his effortless excellence, getting recruited by Division I colleges for both academics and athletics. I continued my methodical approach to everything, studying longer, practicing more, accepting that I'd have to earn every small victory. The real test came junior year, when we both enrolled in AP Chemistry. Kevin breezed through the first semester with minimal effort, understanding concepts that required hours of study for me to grasp. I spent my evenings working through practice problems while he hung out with friends or played video games. But something interesting happened as the material got more complex. Kevin, who'd never had to develop study strategies, started struggling when natural intuition wasn't enough. Meanwhile, I'd been building learning systems that could handle increasing difficulty. When he got his first C on a chemistry test, Kevin came to me for help. "I don't understand," he said, staring at his graded exam. "I've always been good at science. Why is this so hard?" I looked at his test and saw the pattern immediately. He'd relied on instinct instead of systematic problem solving. When intuition failed, he had no backup strategy. "Want to study together for the next test?" I offered. Kevin looked surprised. We'd been classmates for years, but he'd never needed help from anyone, especially not from me. For 2 weeks, I taught Kevin the methodical approach I'd developed over years of struggling with difficult material. How to break complex problems into manageable steps. How to check work systematically. How to identify patterns in different types of questions. When our test scores came back, Kevin had earned his A. But more importantly, he'd learned something that natural talent had never taught him. How to learn when learning didn't come easily. "Danny," he said after class, "how did you know all those study strategies?" "Because I've never been able to understand anything the first time," I replied. "I've had to figure out how to learn everything the hard way." For the first time, Kevin looked at me with something resembling respect. Senior year brought college applications and the anxiety of competing with naturally gifted students like Kevin for limited spots at good schools. My SAT scores were solid but not spectacular. My GPA was respectable but not remarkable. I didn't have Kevin's athletic scholarships or natural charisma. What I did have was a track record of improvement, persistence, and the ability to articulate what I'd learned from struggling. In my college essay, I wrote about the F in 3rd grade math and how it taught me that initial failure didn't determine final outcomes. I described the humiliation of that 7th grade presentation and how it motivated me to develop communication skills through practice rather than relying on natural ability. Some students arrive at college with impressive talent, I wrote. I'll arrive with something different, the knowledge that any skill can be developed through systematic effort and the willingness to struggle through the learning process. 3 colleges accepted me, not because I was the most naturally gifted applicant, but because admissions officers recognized something valuable in a student who'd learned to transform weakness into strength. College was challenging, but I'd spent years preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. While naturally talented students struggled when courses exceeded their comfort zones, I thrived in environments that required systematic learning and persistent effort. My freshman roommate, Marcus, reminded me of Kevin, brilliant, charismatic, accustomed to easy success. By midterm, Marcus was failing 2 classes because he'd never learned to study effectively. "How do you make it look so easy?" Marcus asked, watching me work through organic chemistry problems that were giving him nightmares. "It's not easy," I said. "I just learned a long time ago how to break down hard things into manageable pieces." I spent the next month teaching Marcus the study strategies I developed over years of academic struggle, not because I wanted to help competition, but because I understood what it felt like to be lost in material that seemed impossible. Marcus passed his classes and became one of my closest friends. More importantly, he learned something about the difference between being naturally smart and being effectively prepared. Junior year, I decided to major in education with a focus on learning disabilities. My years of struggling had taught me something valuable. The students who had the hardest time learning often developed the deepest understanding of how learning actually worked. During my student teaching placement, I was assigned to work with kids who were failing in traditional classroom settings. Kids like I'd been, not lacking intelligence, but needing different approaches to access their capability. My supervising teacher, Mrs. Williams, watched me work with a student named Jake, who'd been labeled as having attention problems. "Jake doesn't have an attention problem," I told her after observing him for a week. "He has an interest problem. He can focus for hours on things that engage him, but he shuts down when material isn't presented in ways that connect to his thinking style." I developed alternative lesson plans that used Jake's interests in skateboarding to teach math concepts. Within a month, Jake was solving problems that had frustrated him all year. "How did you know to approach it that way?" Mrs. Williams asked. "Because I spent years figuring out how to learn things that didn't make sense to me the traditional way," I explained. "Kids like Jake aren't broken. They just need teachers who understand different types of intelligence." After graduation, I was hired by Roosevelt Elementary to develop programs for students who were struggling in traditional academic settings. The principal, Dr. Foster, had heard about my student teaching success with difficult students. "We have kids who are falling behind because they don't learn the way we teach," she told me. "We need someone who understands their perspective." My first year, I worked with 23 students who'd been labeled as having learning problems. Instead of trying to fix what was wrong with them, I focused on understanding how their minds worked and developing teaching strategies that matched their learning styles. By the end of the year, 18 of those students had caught up to grade level, and 5 had exceeded it. But more importantly, they'd learned that struggling with traditional methods didn't mean they were less intelligent than their peers. "Mr. Davis," said Maria, a 4th grader who'd been convinced she was bad at math, "you made me understand that I'm not stupid. I just learned different." That comment crystallized everything I'd discovered about the relationship between struggle and success. The students who experience the most difficulty with conventional approaches often develop the most creative and resilient learning strategies. Their struggles weren't deficits to be overcome. They were different paths to the same destinations. Word spread about our program's success. Other schools started requesting consultations on how to work with students who didn't fit traditional mold. 5 years later, I was running professional development workshops for teachers across 3 states, sharing strategies for recognizing different types of intelligence and helping all students access their capability. But the workshop that meant the most to me was the one I presented at Kevin's school. Kevin had become a high school math teacher, and he'd invited me to speak to his faculty about working with struggling students. "Danny's going to share insights that I never could have developed," Kevin told his colleagues in his introduction. "He understands something about learning that those of us who found school easy never had to discover." During my presentation, I talked about the difference between being naturally gifted and being systematically prepared, about how students who struggle early often develop meta-learning skills that serve them better in the long run than raw talent alone. After the workshop, Kevin and I sat in his classroom, looking at the posters and projects his students had created. "You know what's funny?" Kevin said. "I always thought you'd end up jealous of how easily everything came to me. But watching what you've built, I think I'm the one who missed out." "How so?" "You learned how to learn. You developed resilience, creativity, systematic thinking. When my natural abilities hit their limits, I didn't have backup strategies. You built capabilities that could expand infinitely." Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. Natural talent opens doors and creates early advantages. Hard work sustains progress and builds competence over time. But the unseen lessons from everyday struggles, the meta skills of adaptation, persistence, and creative problem solving, those are the capabilities that determine long-term success. Kevin was right about one thing. I learned how to learn. More than that, I learned that initial difficulty didn't predict final outcomes. I learned that every struggle contained lessons that success couldn't teach. Today, my program serves over 500 students across 12 schools. We've helped countless kids who were written off by traditional systems discover discover their own paths to success. But the insight that drives everything we do came from that F in third grade math. Your starting point doesn't determine your ending point. How you respond to difficulty shapes who you become far more than what comes easily ever could. When I meet with parents whose children are struggling, I tell them something that would have comforted my 8-year-old self. The students who have to work hardest to understand material often develop the deepest understanding of how understanding works. They're not behind. They're learning skills their naturally gifted peers might never need to develop. And when I work with kids like I used to be, the ones who study harder and longer for results that come easily to others, I share the most important lesson my struggles taught me. Every challenge you face is teaching you something that easy success never could. You're not lacking talent. You're developing capabilities that talent alone can't create. The F that once felt like evidence of my inadequacy became the foundation for understanding how real learning happens. The struggles that seemed like obstacles became the tools for helping others navigate their own difficult journey. Sometimes what shapes us most isn't what comes naturally, but what we build from the pieces of what doesn't. Last month, I received a letter that brought everything full circle. It was from Maria, the 4th grader who'd once believed she was bad at math. She's now a sophomore at MIT, majoring in engineering. Mr. Davis, she wrote, I wanted you to know that everything you taught me about learning differently became the foundation for everything I achieved. You didn't just help me pass 4th grade. You helped me understand that my brain works beautifully, just not the way everyone expected. Reading her letter, I thought about all the students like her, like me, who needed someone to recognize that struggle wasn't a sign of deficiency, but evidence of a different kind of strength being forged. That evening, I walked past the elementary school where I'd first received that crushing F in 3rd grade. The building looked smaller now, but the memory remained vivid. That moment when I learned I wasn't naturally gifted at anything that seemed to matter. Now I understand that the F wasn't the end of a story about limitation. It was the beginning of a story about transformation. Every student I've helped, every program I've built, every life that's been changed, it all traces back to that moment when failure became my teacher instead of my verdict. The real validation of this philosophy came 2 years ago when the Department of Education invited me to lead a national task force on alternative learning approaches. Our mandate was to develop strategies for the 20% of students who consistently underperform in traditional educational settings. Dr. Davis, said Secretary Martinez during our first meeting, we're spending billions trying to fix students who don't learn conventionally. What if we're approaching this wrong? I thought about Maria, about Jake, about all the kids who'd been labeled as problems when they were actually solutions waiting to be recognized. What if instead of fixing these students, I proposed, we learned from them? What if their different approaches to learning could teach us better ways to educate everyone? The task force spent 18 months studying schools where struggling students thrived. We visited programs that had transformed their approaches, interviewed teachers who'd learned to see learning differences as assets, and most importantly, talked to students themselves about what worked for them. The patterns were clear. Students who struggled in traditional settings often developed extraordinary capabilities that their conventionally successful peers never needed to cultivate. They became expert problem solvers, creative thinkers, and resilient learners who could adapt to any challenge. These aren't learning disabilities, I wrote in our final report. These are learning differences that, when properly supported, often produce exceptional capability. Our recommendations revolutionized how schools approached struggling students. Instead of remedial programs that treated differences as deficits, we proposed enrichment programs that treated differences as strengths to be developed. The pilot programs launched in 50 schools across 10 states. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Students who'd been written off academically began excelling when their learning styles were recognized and supported. But the breakthrough that made national headlines came from Lincoln Elementary in Detroit, where Principal Dr. Johnson implemented our full model. We stopped asking why these kids couldn't learn like everyone else, Dr. Johnson explained to reporters, and started asking what these kids could teach everyone else about learning. Lincoln Elementary paired struggling students with conventionally successful students as learning partners. The struggling students taught creative problem solving and persistence. The successful students shared organizational and study skills. Within 2 years, Lincoln went from one of the district's lowest performing schools to one of its highest achieving. More importantly, both groups of students developed capabilities they never would have gained in traditional settings. The success story that touched me most deeply came from Tyler, a 5th grader at Lincoln who'd been failing every subject before the program began. Tyler had been labeled as having severe ADHD and learning disabilities. Traditional approaches had consistently failed him, and he'd developed a deep belief that he was simply not smart enough for school. But when teachers began recognizing his hyperactivity as exceptional energy and his distractibility as comprehensive awareness of his environment, everything changed. Tyler doesn't have attention problems, his teacher Ms. Rodriguez observed. He has attention abundance. He notices everything, which makes him incredible at seeing patterns and connections that focused students miss. Tyler became the class expert at finding creative solutions to complex problems. His energy, properly channeled, made him a natural leader who could motivate other students. His broad awareness helped him understand concepts from multiple perspectives. By the end of the year, Tyler was tutoring other students in subjects he'd been failing months earlier. Mr. Davis, Tyler told me during a school visit, you helped my teachers see that I'm not broken. I just work different, and different can be better. That comment sparked the creation of our Different is Better initiative, now implemented in over 200 schools nationwide. The program trains teachers to identify the hidden strengths in every type of learning difference. Students with dyslexia often develop exceptional spatial reasoning and creative thinking abilities. Students with ADHD frequently become outstanding multitaskers and innovative problem solvers. Students with autism often possess remarkable attention to detail and systematic thinking capabilities. We're not just changing how we teach struggling students, I told the International Education Conference last year. We're discovering that students who struggle in traditional systems often possess exactly the capabilities our rapidly changing world needs most: adaptability, creativity, resilience, and the ability to see solutions where others see only problems. The conference audience included educators from 37 countries, all grappling with the same challenge: how to serve students who don't fit conventional educational molds. After my presentation, Dr. Kim from South Korea approached me with tears in her eyes. In my country, we have many students like you described, but we see them only as failures. You have shown me that we are wasting incredible human potential by not recognizing different types of intelligence. 6 months later, Dr. Kim invited me to Seoul to help develop programs based on our model. The South Korean implementation became so successful that it attracted delegations from Japan, Singapore, and Finland. What you've created, said Dr. Anderson from Finland's Ministry of Education, isn't just about helping struggling students succeed. You've discovered how to unlock human potential that traditional educational approaches leave completely untapped. Today, variations of our model operate in 12 countries, but the principle remains the same everywhere. The students who struggle most with conventional approaches often develop the most valuable unconventional capabilities. Kevin, now a principal himself, calls me regularly to discuss implementing these approaches in his school. You know what's amazing? He told me during our last conversation. The kids I was most worried about, the ones who reminded me of how you used to struggle, those are the ones who end up becoming the most creative, resilient, and innovative students in our school. They had to develop those qualities, I reminded him. Success never taught them that they were optional. Last week, I received an invitation that brought my journey completely full circle. Mrs. Henderson, my third grade teacher who'd given me that first devastating F, asked if I would speak at her retirement ceremony. Danny, she said when I called to accept, I need to tell you something I should have said 30 years ago. That F I gave you wasn't a measure of your intelligence. It was a failure of my teaching. You taught me that there are many ways to be smart, and I spent the rest of my career trying to recognize all of them. Standing at her retirement ceremony, looking out at teachers who'd gathered to honor decades of service, I thought about how one moment of failure had become the foundation for thousands of moments of success, not just for me, but for all the students whose different forms of intelligence had been recognized and celebrated instead of corrected and dismissed.